the letter that changed everything. The rain had been falling since dawn, tracing slow, deliberate lines down the tall windows of the old family house. From the outside, it looked peaceful, an aging home wrapped in ivy, standing watch over a quiet street. But inside, the air was thick, almost heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Evelyn Harper sat at the kitchen table, staring into a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. She wasn't drinking it. She wasn't even sure when she had poured it. The minutes had a way of blending together lately, each one indistinguishable from the next, like pages in a book where the ink had begun to fade. In the next room, the faint creak of footsteps betrayed her father's restless pacing. It had been happening for weeks, him walking the same short path across the living room floor, turning sharply and walking back again, like a man tracing an invisible boundary he couldn't bring himself to cross. Something was unraveling in the Harper home, though no one had dared to say it aloud. The silence between them was not the comfortable kind families sometimes share. It was sharper, more brittle, as if a single wrong word could send it shattering into pieces. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wet earth and the faint hum of cars passing in the distance. The neighborhood had a way of disguising its own troubles, its tidy gardens and painted shutters hiding lives far messier than they appeared. Evelyn often wondered how many other houses around her harbored the same kind of tension. The unspoken grievances, the questions that hung in the air like cobwebs no one wanted to touch. Her younger brother, Nathan, had stopped coming downstairs for breakfast. He preferred to linger in his room, emerging only when the house was quiet. It wasn't out of laziness, it was avoidance. In this family, words had become dangerous, weighted with meanings no one wanted to unpack. And yet, despite the cracks forming between them, there was still the faint, stubborn pull of obligation. Dinner was eaten together, even if no one truly spoke. Birthdays were acknowledged, even if the smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. These rituals remained, not because they brought comfort, but because they were proof, however fragile, that the family was still holding on. Evelyn couldn't say when the change had begun. Maybe it had been creeping in for years, subtle enough to ignore until it wasn't. Or maybe it had come all at once, like a storm breaking without warning. Either way, the Harper family now found themselves standing on uncertain ground, where every step felt like it could tip them into something they wouldn't know how to climb back from. The day this story truly began was an ordinary one in every visible way. But beneath the surface, it was the day the thread that held them together began to fray beyond repair. The kind of day that doesn't announce itself, yet leaves a mark so deep you can never quite return to the way things were before. The Harper house had always been a place of contradictions. From the outside, it was the image of stability, a sprawling, ivy-covered home built by Evelyn's grandfather, its weathered brick and wide porch suggesting decades of warmth and tradition. Inside, however, the atmosphere had changed over the years, shifting from something lively and full to something quieter, colder, more measured. Evelyn was the eldest of three, a fact that had shaped her life in ways she didn't always appreciate. Responsibility had been her constant companion, present when she was praised for her good grades, sharper still when she was called upon to mediate the small but relentless frictions between her parents and siblings. Now, at 28, she had returned to the house after years of living on her own, carrying with her a private failure she hadn't yet confessed to anyone. She had come home seeking refuge, but found instead that the old tensions had only deepened in her absence. Nathan, her younger brother by 6 years, had once been the liveliest of them all. As a boy, he filled rooms with energy, his laughter, echoing down the hallways in a way that seemed to soften even their father's stern face. But the Nathan who lived here now was quieter, more guarded, his eyes often fixed on something unseen. He had been back from college for over a year, his plans vague and his moods unpredictable. There were moments when Evelyn thought she saw the old spark in him, but it never lasted. Their father, Leonard, was a man of routines. His life had been built on steady work, steady habits, and a belief that hard effort solved most problems. But retirement had unsettled him in ways he didn't understand, or perhaps refused to admit. Without the structure of his career, his days seemed to stretch out before him like an unmarked road, and he filled the hours with small, restless movements, pacing, tidying, checking and rechecking things that didn't need attention. Their mother, Margaret, still moved through the house with a certain quiet efficiency, as if determined to keep the machinery of family life running, even when the engine faltered. She spoke sparingly, her thoughts often tucked away behind a faint, unreadable expression. In her silence, there was both strength and withdrawal, two qualities that had sustained her in different seasons of life, though neither seemed to bridge the growing distance between them all. The Harper family had always been private, even with one another. Their love was real, but it was a love that seldom declared itself in words or gestures. Instead, it was woven into the way Margaret folded Nathan's laundry without asking, the way Leonard checked the locks each night before bed, the way Evelyn brewed her father's tea exactly the way he liked it, though he never thanked her outright. These small acts were their language. Yet beneath these quiet routines lay an accumulation of things left unsaid, disappointments unvoiced, misunderstandings allowed to calcify, years of letting small grievances pass unexamined until they formed a kind of sediment at the bottom of every interaction. The house carried echoes of what it had once been. There had been years when its walls held bursts of conversation, Sunday, dinners that stretched into long evenings, and laughter that spilled through open windows in summer. But over time, these moments had thinned. Now, the sounds that filled the Harper home were softer, less certain. The creak of floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional closing of a door upstairs. Evelyn, newly returned, could feel the weight of all this in the way her family moved around each other. They were careful, as though each step, each glance, needed to be measured to avoid stirring something fragile or volatile. And in that carefulness was the unspoken truth. Something had been broken for a long time. No one knew exactly when. No one knew how to fix it. What none of them could see yet was how quickly the quiet balance they maintained was about to tip, and how, once it did, the truths they had all avoided would come rushing to the surface, whether they were ready or not. It began with a lettered "IT" arrived one Thursday morning, slipped through the brass slot in the front door along with a handful of bills and flyers. Margaret found it first, resting at the top of the pile. Its envelope was thick, the paper an unfamiliar shade of cream, the return address written in a hand she didn't recognize. She didn't open it. Instead, she placed it on the hallway table, where it sat like an object of quiet suspicion, by the time Evelyn noticed it later that afternoon. The letter had not moved. It seemed oddly deliberate, lying there untouched, as though its presence alone had already altered the atmosphere of the house. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands, her eyes catching on the unfamiliar name printed in small, careful letters. She didn't know why, but something about it felt personal, dangerously so. No one mentioned it at dinner that night, though she noticed her father's eyes flick briefly toward the hallway as they ate. Nathan kept his gaze fixed on his plate, pushing food around in distracted, uneven movements. Margaret, as usual, spoke very little, but there was something taut in the way she moved, her gestures sharper, her fork clinking against her plate in a rhythm that betrayed her thoughts were elsewhere in the days that followed. The letter remained where it had been placed. None of them spoke of it, but its presence seemed to hum quietly in the background, like a faint vibration running through the floorboards. It was as though each of them was waiting for someone else to acknowledge it first, knowing that once it was opened, whatever was inside could not be undone. The house itself seemed more restless, Leonard's pacing grew longer, his steps sharper. Nathan started staying out later, returning only when the rest of the family had gone to bed. Evelyn found herself wandering the rooms at night, her fingers trailing along the edges of furniture, her mind circling questions she couldn't quite name. There had always been unspoken rules in the Harper household, boundaries of conversation, topics that remained sealed away. But now, with the letter sitting in plain sight, those rules felt both more fragile and more dangerous. It wasn't just about the letter anymore. It was about everything that might come spilling out with it. Evelyn began to notice other things, small changes, the kind that didn't mean much alone, but together formed a pattern she couldn't ignore. Her father's voice had taken on a clipped tone when speaking to her mother, his eyes avoiding hers more often than not. Nathan had started locking his bedroom door, something he'd never done before. Margaret, once meticulous about the house, seemed to let small things slide. An unwashed cup, a stack of unopened mail by the kitchen phone. It was as though the letter had awakened something that had been sleeping beneath the surface. A slow, simmering unrest. One evening, Evelyn found herself in the living room, the letter still on the hallway table behind her. She could feel it there, the weight of it pressing into the quiet. She thought about opening it herself, just to end the waiting. But she didn't. Some instinct told her it wasn't hers to open, even if it was already affecting her as much as anyone else. Instead, she stood by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. In its distorted reflection, she caught sight of her family in the adjoining room. Her father pacing, her mother at the sink, Nathan leaning against the doorway with his arms folded. Each of them occupied their own small space, as if the room had invisible lines they could not cross. The letter remained unopened for another 3 days. And when it was finally read, it would not just answer questions. It would shatter the fragile quiet they had been guarding for years. It was Margaret who finally broke the silence on a gray Monday morning. She came into the kitchen before anyone else was awake, the house still heavy with that peculiar stillness before the day begins. She set a knife on the counter, meaning to slice bread for breakfast, but her hand drifted instead to the envelope on the hallway table. She stared at it for a long moment, her thumb tracing the edge of the paper before she slid it open with a single, decisive motion. The sound was soft, almost nothing at all. Yet in that moment, it was as though something deep within the house shifted, like a beam giving way in the dark. The letter was longer than she expected. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, every curve and line betraying careful thought. She read it once through without stopping, her face unreadable. Then she read it again, slower this time, as if weighing each word against the years that had come before it. It'd be why the time Leonard entered the kitchen, she had placed the open letter on the table. She didn't look at him as he approached, but he froze when he saw it. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening in a way Evelyn had only ever seen during arguments that ended without resolution. Nathan came in moments later, still in the faded hoodie he had slept in. He glanced between them, sensing the tension immediately. Then his gaze fell on the letter. For a brief second, Evelyn thought she saw something flicker in his expression, not surprise exactly, but recognition. The air felt electric, as though a storm was about to break directly over the house. No one moved. No one spoke. It was Evelyn, who finally stepped forward, drawn to the letter as though it were some long-buried artifact that had been unearthed for them all to see. Her eyes scanned the page, the words striking her like cold water. A carefully written explanation, an admission of something that had been hidden for decades. The writer claimed to be a half-sibling, born from a relationship Leonard had kept, secret from everyone. The tone was not accusatory, but searching. There was no demand for money or apology, only a quiet request for acknowledgement, perhaps even connection. The revelation tore through Evelyn with a force she couldn't disguise. All the unspoken tensions, the quiet avoidance, the subtle fractures, they suddenly had a shape. A name. Leonard's voice finally broke the silence, though it was low, almost hoarse. He did not defend himself. He did not explain. He simply stood there, staring at the letter as though it were a thing capable of undoing him entirely. Margaret remained still, her hands folded in front of her, her face calm in the way a sea looks. Calm before a wave crashes. Evelyn could feel the weight of her mother's restraint, the way she was holding herself together not for forgiveness, but for control. That Nathan's reaction was different. He leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms tightly, his gaze fixed on the floor. Evelyn realized then that his distance over the past year might not have been distance at all. It might have been a quiet, private burden he had carried. Alone, the kitchen felt smaller than it had ever been, the walls closing in around the four of them. The letter lay in the center of the table, its folded edges still crisp, as though it had not just set fire to the fragile fabric of their family. For years, the Harpers had lived in careful silence, each guarding truths too heavy to name. Now, with just a few lines of ink, those truths were out in the open, and there was no retreating back into the safety of not knowing. The rain outside quickened, the sound pressing against the windows like a crowd desperate to get in. Inside, the air was thick with a new reality, one none of them had chosen, but all of them would now have to live with. The days that followed passed in a strange, suspended quiet. No one mentioned the letter directly, but its presence was everywhere, an invisible thread tugging at each moment, each glance, each pause in conversation. Evelyn noticed how her mother's hands lingered a little longer over ordinary tasks, as if she were grounding herself in small motions, folding the dish towel precisely, arranging the cups in their cupboard with almost mathematical order. Margaret did not ask questions, at least, not aloud, but there was something in her stillness that spoke of long hours spent sifting through memories, re-examining the past with a harsher light. Leonard kept to his routines, but they felt mechanical now, stripped of the quiet purpose they once carried. He still checked the locks at night and walked his familiar pacing paths, but his movements seemed smaller somehow, his shoulders lower, his eyes duller. Evelyn caught him once in the study, sitting at his desk with the letter in front of him, staring at it as though searching for words that would not come. Nathan was the most changed. He started leaving the house early in the morning, sometimes not returning until after dark. When Evelyn asked where he'd been, he would shrug, his answers vague and unconvincing. She suspected he was avoiding the house as much as he was avoiding the subject, unwilling, or perhaps unable, to exist in the thick air that had settled over them all. Evelyn herself felt the shift in every part of her day. The familiar spaces of the house felt altered, as if the rooms themselves had absorbed the truth and were holding it in their walls. Even the air seemed different, heavier. At night, she lay awake listening to the quiet. No longer the calm silence she remembered from childhood, but something more fragile, brittle, as if one sudden noise might cause it to crack entirely in moments alone. She found herself thinking less about the half-sibling and more about what their existence meant for the people in front of her. She wondered if her parents' marriage had been built on an unspoken agreement to overlook certain truths. She wondered if Nathan had known more than he had let on, if he had been carrying a piece of this knowledge for longer than anyone realized. The Harper family had always functioned on the belief that love, though seldom spoken, was understood. But now Evelyn questioned that assumption. Was love still the same when it had to hold the weight of betrayal? Could it remain steady when the foundation it rested on had shifted without warning? There was no confrontation, no late-night argument to clear the air. Instead, they moved forward as if walking across a frozen lake, each step careful, each breath measured, all of them aware of the cracks forming beneath their feet. But silence, Evelyn knew, was not the same as peace. And the longer they avoided speaking, the more certain she became that the truth had not simply changed the story of their past. It was already shaping the story of their future. Spring came late that year, arriving not with a burst of color, but with a slow, tentative thaw. The snow along the edges of the street melted in uneven patches, revealing damp earth and the first shy tips of grass. In the Harper home, life began to resume its rhythms, but the air never fully cleared. The letter had not destroyed them, but it had changed them, leaving a mark that no season could erase. Margaret eventually placed the letter in the desk drawer of the study, sliding it between old tax documents and clipped newspaper articles. She didn't lock it away, perhaps as a quiet acknowledgement that it was part of their story now, but she didn't leave it out either. It became something neither hidden nor displayed, much like the truth it carried. Leonard spoke little of it. On rare occasions, Evelyn would catch him staring out the window with a distant expression, his lips moving faintly, as though rehearsing words he would never say. His movements were still measured, his routine still intact, but there was a new, almost imperceptible caution in the way he looked at each of them, as though unsure which part of himself they now saw. Nathan remained restless, drifting in and out of the house like a tide. Evelyn suspected he was searching for something, perhaps a distraction, perhaps an escape. Yet there were moments when she caught a flicker of resolve in him, as if he was beginning to understand that avoiding the truth was its own form of imprisonment. Evelyn herself found a strange clarity in the months that followed. She no longer searched for a way back to how things had been. That past, she realized, had always been more complicated than it appeared. Instead, she began to accept that family was not a fixed thing. It was a shifting landscape, shaped by both what was shared and what was withheld that in quiet moments. She imagined the half-sibling somewhere out there, someone who carried pieces of their father's story in their face, their voice, their mannerisms. She wondered if they had been waiting for a reply, if they still hoped for connection. She didn't know whether that bridge would ever be crossed, but she knew, at least for herself, that pretending they didn't exist was no longer possible. One afternoon in late May, Evelyn stood at the edge of the back garden, watching the wind move through the tall grass. The house behind her was still, sunlight pooling across its brick walls. She thought about how, for all its cracks and shadows, it still stood. And perhaps that was the point, not to erase what had fractured, but to learn how to live with it, to carry it forward without letting it consume everything else. The Harper family would not return to the version of themselves they had been before the letter arrived. But they would keep moving, in the way families do. Not perfectly, not without strain, but with the quiet persistence of those who know that even in the wake of truth, there are still moments worth holding on to. And somewhere between the weight of what had been revealed and the uncertainty of what lay ahead, Evelyn found a fragile kind of peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of knowing, of seeing clearly and still choosing to stay. The end.